Hello and welcome to another conversation from the Centre for International Security and Governance at the University of Bonn. I'm Zulfikar Abbany, a senior editor at Deutsche Welle, a German public broadcaster, and I'm your host, as it were. We're really happy this time to have Dr. Anna Sauerbrey, opinion editor at Der Tagesspiegel, a daily newspaper here in Germany. And the reason for that is because we're going to talk about the G20, and not only the G20, but most in particular, the G20 in Hamburg at the start of July. Dr. Anna Sauerbrey, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent stuff. Now, before we get stuck in, I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the G20. The G20, as you may think, is a group of 20. It's the group of 20 largest economies, but that's 19 countries plus the European Union. So you might think that in some senses, some are represented more than once. It gets together once a year, which makes this one just gone in Hamburg, the first for the US President, Donald Trump, and indeed the first for the French President, Emmanuel Macron. So two newbies there at the start. This being a time of considerable tension. You've got to think about a lot of things here. Syria, North Korea, I'm going to go down my list here, so bear with me. Ongoing disagreements about climate change, protectionism, cybersecurity, stresses in the networked world, as the German Chancellor Angela Merkel likes to talk about and point out, financial and tax regulations around the world, immigration, and a distrust of large organizations and bodies such as the G20 itself. So what do we do there? The list goes on and on. Now, the G20 has no physical headquarters, and yet it's, you could say, a reasonably powerful bloc. It makes up about 2/3 of the world population, 75% of world trade, so it is huge. And its first test came, of course, during the 2008 or 2008 financial crisis, which analysts said it handled rather well. Since then, however, cohesion seems to be failing in the G20. So we want to find out, how is the G20 handling today's dynamics on the world stage, and how should it change, must it change, to reflect the new world order? So let's get stuck into that right now. Dr. Anna Sauerbrey, before the G20 in Hamburg, you wrote that the new world order is not necessarily about good and bad or being good and bad. It's more about who's willing to cooperate. So was the G20 in Hamburg a success for the team players or the naysayers?
I think you can say that it was a success for the team players. I mean, the expectations were low, as you said, in a time of crisis. Afterwards, the world pretty much just audibly exhaled and said, well, it's so great that they've met and they've talked and we've got a communique, and it's a common communique except for climate change. So that is a success, certainly, for the team players around Angela Merkel, but also China, also Russia. And sort of the two enfants terribles at the summit, Trump and Erdogan, were at least disciplined enough not to make the summit explode or make it a failure. But that is with low expectations.
Low expectations, that's very interesting. I mean, you mentioned, one of the enfants terribles there, but there's also the Russian side of things. We're going to get a little bit deeper into it in a moment, but I mean, a lot of the focus was on Donald Trump and, the US's relationship with Russia at this time. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, seemed to be the first to come out with a very sort of conciliatory tone, by saying that Trump in person is not Trump on TV. Later, Trump came out and said, it's time to work constructively with Russia. So what does that mean? I mean, what does work constructively with Russia mean for Trump, do you think?
Well, he came up with this very bizarre idea of cooperating with Russia, for example, in the field of cybersecurity, which I believe is quite a funny idea, and he got beaten for that at home, and he has dropped the idea by now. So we're not sure yet what it could mean. He's very incoherent in many of his policies, or he's got a foreign minister who's sometimes saying the exact opposite of what Trump says. And we've seen that beforehand the summit in the Russian case too, that he's on one hand attacking Russia, then he's saying, well, he's still not sure whether they are behind the cyber attacks on the Democratic Committee. Then he goes to Poland and he holds a very aggressive speech there, which puts Russia basically on the same side with the Soviet Union and its aggressions against Poland during the Second World War. And then he meets with Putin for 2 hours, and they seem to find an accord, and they seem to get along quite well. And all that was lacking, that Trump was saying that, well, this is a really great guy. So I think we don't know yet. I think it can turn, it's very hopeful that Russia and the United States have agreed on working together in Syria, trying to assure a ceasefire. So there seems to be the beginning of maybe a constructive relationship, but we never know. It might be all turned over tomorrow.
Okay, well, we'll get deeper into that in just a moment. A little bit sort of still staying in a broad level in a way to move away from that Trump versus the rest dynamic and whatever. What else should we take away from the G20 meeting in Hamburg? I mean, the leaders of the G20 can't negotiate as a bloc as such, but they do have some kind of impetus and some influence. What can we expect the impact of this meeting to be in the medium to long term, do you think? Apart from these sort of like the things we don't know, as you mentioned there.
Yes, I think it's always very hard to say, because as far as concrete policy achievements go, the G20 have sort of a mixed record. In some points, for example, when you look at the financial track, they have been very successful, and some of the things they agreed on, like more control over financial institutions and banks and hedge funds. They have been written into national law, for example, in the United States. Also, when you look at the climate process, they have agreed in, I believe, 2008 to keep the 1.5 Celsius degree global warming increase, and it actually was agreed much later on in the Paris Agreement, which pretty much everybody signed. So there are some achievements that originate in the G8 or G20 process and actually are taken further, but in other respects they are not very successful. They always, or at least they always agree on enforcing free trade. They have done so this time, though with a very weak wording. But when you look at the facts, many of the new protectionist measures we see in the world every year are actually measures that are that originate in G20 countries. So it's a mixed record.
Okay, so what can you tell us about the main players, though? I mean, were any of the main players or main powers able to improve their standing at this meeting? Are there any sort of bigger success stories?
China has been very cooperative and has sought to negotiate even beforehand the summit. Xi Jinping came to Berlin. There was an agreement with Germany on the delivery of 140 Airbus. So this is sort of a signal of strengthening the German-Chinese relationship as far as trade goes. He also went to Moscow to find an accord with Vladimir Putin. He has stood by the European Union when it came to the Paris Agreement and has said China stands by you, which are all very important symbolic gestures, though also there we could look at how the record actually is. It's a different world, but I think China actually rose as one of those who want to be in the cooperative field and who made a very strong statement. And well, the losers sort of are the United States, because they were not part of this beforehand diplomacy. He didn't participate in any of the important meetings with other state leaders, and he was isolated on the summit in one of the most important goals,
so
is climate.
The climate change, right? Because there was the statement that said basically we have 19 who are showing their continued support. And the US is on the outer.
Yes.
So, okay, tell us a little bit more, though, about Turkey's result from the meeting.
Well, Erdogan did not care about coming there with a diplomatic gesture. Just a few days before the summit, he had a couple of amnesty workers in Turkey arrested. That I think it was a provocation also towards Germany, which he addressed in very strong terms in an interview published just beforehand the summit. So he came accompanied by a lot of aggressive rhetoric, and of course there's still the question of German citizens being in custody in Turkey without being fully charged. And he went away from the summit, and the day after he sort of distances himself from the accord on climate. So I guess it will be this shows that it will be very hard to work with Turkey on many fields in the years to come.
So you're obviously very keen to talk about the climate change thing, the Paris Accord. I can tell that. So tell us a little bit more about that. Perhaps could you tell me that if we come away from the summit with this statement that there are 19 for and there's one against or whatever in Turkey as well, I mean, could President Trump then perhaps start to read between the lines that perhaps multilateralism is perhaps the way forward that might lead to progress, a better future for his presidency?
Is Trump embracing multilateralism?
Well, I'm saying, could he eventually start to read between the lines in this, the outcome of the summit, that maybe I better change my tack?
I don't think he will, because as much as it may have been a failure for him to be isolated on the international field, it's certainly a success at home, because that's what his supporters expect him to do, especially the core supporters who still stand by him. So I don't think he cares whether he looks bad on the international scene when he comes home and he's cheered by his supporters. That's all he needs, and that's what he wanted when he had that speech in the Rose Garden, telling the world basically that the United States are not part of the agreement anymore.
You touched on Germany's performance, and I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, how do you assess, in broad terms, Germany's performance on this world stage here? In a very actually critical time for Angela Merkel as well.
Yeah, I think she's done well, and she has achieved what could be achieved. I mean, you can always say it wasn't a great success, but I think she did what could be done, and she has once again portrayed herself as the diplomat, as the coordinator in international affairs that she's been before. When you look at the Normandy format or the Iran agreement where Germany played a role. So I believe for her it was a success, and it showed her capacities as a diplomat.
But can we talk about a growing influence? I mean, can Angela Merkel's influence grow even more?
No, I don't think so. I think that's pretty much it, because we've talked a lot about Germany being the last defender of the liberal West, which was the New York Times headline, and many people see her as the new world leader. But I think Germany's role will never be the one of a world leader, because as much as maybe power, and there are new axes in the field of trade policy. We can see in the European-Asian axis being strengthened by the American withdrawal, or at least some steps towards that. And also Germany is certainly having a more important role in the European Union, and a more important role as a coordinator. But we lack the military power. We lack it in Germany, and we lack it on the European level. And even if I feel that there is more, there's more willingness to go forward in this field too, it will still take decades until the European level the United States level is reached. So that's not really the question.
Sorry, do you think that military aspect influences Germany's dealings with the United States, with Russia and Turkey, that it doesn't have that sort of that military effectiveness or impact, as you were sort of alluding to there?
I think it doesn't really play a role in the direct relation between the United States. It's certainly a very contested field of policy between the United States and Europe, particularly with Trump in office. I don't think Turkey would act any different if Germany had stronger military power, because even if we have this really strong culture of pacifism, and I don't think Germany would ever get into a military conflict with either Russia or Turkey. It's more a question of proliferation and how much can Germany attribute to NATO and other and the common European defense.
Okay, so let's look, as we sort of begin to wrap up a little bit, let's look at the G20 itself. I mean, how effective do you think it is as a body? Does it have to change?
There have been suggestions in Germany beforehand the summit that it should change, but I think in the end everybody agrees that, I mean, as you've portrayed the times of crisis, I think the G20 are rather getting more important than less important, because it's just an informal format. It's small enough to be informal and to really talk, but it's big enough to be relevant and to include enough powers. So particularly in these times, I think they are more important because they take on some functions that are blocked within the United Nations, for example.
Okay, maybe you'd like to give us an example there, perhaps, or tell us how you can see it being more effective then?
Yeah, because the United Nations processes, for example, in Syria, has not been very successful, and it's good that we see alternative formats and see things talked through at informal occasions, like between the United States and Russia at the G20 summit.
So, if it's an informal structure, but there's a lot of talk about the world order as it stands now and how the G20 can influence that in itself. Did you see any shifts there in the world order structure, architecture, whatever you want to call it?
I mean, it was new that the United States stood fairly isolated in 2 points in the declaration, but otherwise I think we see that the big shift is taking place much more slowly than maybe some people would imagine, because after all, it's the same people coming together and everybody is pretty much taking their role. No, I don't see any radical changes within this format. Okay,
so the distrust that the United States might throw towards the UN or NATO, we might not see that necessarily with G20.
No, but I mean, he has backed away from the most radical position. Trump has backed away from the most radical positions he has taken. And I mean, with this visit in Poland beforehand, the G20 summit, I think he has now openly embraced in very strong terms the Article 5, and he has sort of the rhetoric has followed up on what we've seen all the time, that he's not really changing the United States position within NATO, or that he's changing his policy of strengthening the Eastern European countries militarily against Russia. So this is now also outspoken, and so I think this is like a very important point, which sort of brings me to saying, well, the changes are not that radical after all, because he stays with Europe and he sticks with NATO.
Dr. Anna Sauerbrey, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that's the conversation this time with Dr. Anna Sauerbrey, opinion editor of Der Tagesspiegel, the German newspaper. That's all. As I say, just one final thing before I get a head kicking for not mentioning it. This is the Centre for International Security and Governance's new English reader, and I urge you all to get a copy of it. International Security in the 21st Century, Germany's International Responsibility. And as I say, this does exist in German. This is the English translation, and it's well worth a read, so get hold of that if you can. I'm sure there are details everywhere in good bookshops and online, so go for it. I'm Zulfikar Abbany. Until next time, bye now.